Every nurse in that clinic froze. They knew exactly who had walked through that door. They knew what happened to people who got involved in his world. And not one of them moved. Except her. Zoraida didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, walked straight to the most dangerous man in Seoul, looked past him like he was furniture, and got to work on his sister's face. He had never been looked through like that in his life. What happened after that? What she found out weeks later, what it cost him to stay, what he burned down to keep her. Nobody in that clinic could have predicted it. Including Zoraida. Especially Zoraida. If this story already has your heart racing, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This is about to get so much worse before it gets better. And I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The doors opened and the room stopped breathing. Not slowly. All at once. A receptionist mid-sentence went silent. Doctor checking a chart looked up, then looked back down at the floor. 3 nurses near the station pressed themselves against the wall without moving their feet. Nobody ran. Nobody shouted. Nobody reached for a trauma kit. They stood in the particular, suffocating fear of people who understood that getting involved in this man's world could cost them everything. Ji-hwan walked in. Charcoal suit, broad frame, a face that moved through the room like a blade. Not looking for trouble, just making clear that trouble had already been located and dealt with, and this was what came after. He had one arm around his younger sister, Min-hee. A wound had split her left cheek from cheekbone to jaw. Blood was running freely down her neck, soaking into her white blouse collar, dripping onto the polished floor in a slow, steady rhythm that every trained professional in the room could hear. Not one of them moved to help. Then Zoraida came around the corner. She was already carrying a trauma tray. She moved fast. Not running, but the kind of walk that has already made a decision before the body has finished catching up. Natural hair pinned back, dark scrubs, eyes fixed on Min-hee's face like she was reading a problem she intended to solve. She passed every frozen colleague without looking at them. She stepped past Ji-hwan without looking at him either, without registering him at all, and crouched in front of his sister. "I need to sit you down, right now. Can you walk?" Min-hee nodded. "Good. Follow me." She stood, looked at Ji-hwan for exactly 1 second. "You too." She walked away. He followed. He hadn't followed anyone anywhere in 11 years. The treatment room was small and bright. Overhead lights hummed at a frequency that put most people on edge. The smell of antiseptic was sharp and clean. A stool scraped against tile as Zoraida positioned Min-hee under the light. One hand already pressing gauze to the wound, the other reaching for her chart, without looking away from the girl's face. She kept talking. Low voice, steady pace, not stopping. Asking Min-hee about her apartment, the view from her window, her favorite thing to eat after a long day. Keeping the girl's mind somewhere softer while her hands did the difficult work. Checking wound depth, applying pressure, assessing whether the cheekbone had caught the blade or only the skin. The kind of focus that doesn't announce itself, doesn't perform, just does. Ji-hwan stood in the corner with his arms folded and watched. He had watched surgeons operate under pressure. He had watched negotiators dismantle men across boardroom tables. He had watched soldiers hold themselves together in conditions designed to take them apart. He had never watched anyone work the way this woman worked. No awareness of him in it. No calculation about the room. Just complete, total commitment to the person in front of her. He didn't exist to her. He couldn't remember the last time that had been true about anything. Then it happened. Min-hee winced and pulled back slightly. Zoraida leaned forward to check the deepest part of the wound, angling her head, and one strand of natural hair escaped its pin and fell across her cheek. Ji-hwan reached across without thinking and brushed it back from her face. She went still. Not startled, not afraid. Just still. The way a person goes still when something unexpected happens that isn't unwelcome. She turned her head and looked at him from less than a foot away. And Ji-hwan, who had not been truly seen in a very long time, felt something open in the center of his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with his sister's injury. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds, calm, curious, completely unbothered. Then she turned back to Min-hee and kept working. His hand was still raised. He didn't know how long he stood there. She didn't look back. And somehow the returning to work, the not looking back, the absolute refusal to make his gesture into a moment, was the most compelling thing anyone had ever done. He stayed long after Min-hee was settled in a private room. No operational reason for it. His driver was parked outside. His security team was in the lot. He stayed in the corridor leaning against the wall, watching Zoraida clean her tray under the sharp fluorescent light, her movements unhurried, methodical, like a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be. She looked up. "You can go." "I know," he said. "You're in the way of my next patient." The waiting room cleared when I walked in. A pause. She set down the instrument she was holding on the steel tray with a soft click. She looked at him with the directness of someone who has already made a decision and is just checking whether it holds. "Most people in this building are afraid of you," she said. "Most people," he said. "I'm a trauma nurse." She picked up the tray and turned toward the door. "I decided a long time ago I wouldn't spend my shifts on fear." A beat. "Thank you for bringing her in. She's going to be fine." She walked away. He let her go. And then he went home and sat in his office in the dark for a long time, thinking about a woman who had looked at the most feared man in Seoul and seen nothing remarkable, just someone standing in her way. He made one decision that night. He was going to find out everything about her. That decision set off a chain of events he could not have predicted. Not because of what he found out about her, because of what she eventually found out about him. Subscribe now and tell me where you're watching from. Because what comes next is not gentle. Not even a little. The investigation into Min-hee's attack started that same night. Ji-hwan's people moved through the city like a cold front, quiet, systematic, closing from every angle at once. They pulled threads, called in debts, applied the kind of silent, suffocating pressure his organization had refined over 2 decades. The picture that assembled itself over the next 72 hours was not what anyone anticipated. It was worse. Hyo-sun. 9 years at Ji-hwan's left shoulder. The man Ji-hwan had promoted from nothing, trusted with every major operation, shared midnight strategy sessions with over-cold coffee in the operations room. That man had ordered the blade that opened Min-hee's face. Not out of ambition alone. The attack was a distraction, timed precisely to pull Ji-hwan's focus away from a critical shipment that Hyo-sun was quietly redirecting into his own holdings. He had arranged for Ji-hwan's sister's face to be cut, to buy himself 48 hours. When Ji-hwan's men brought him in, the room was small and cold. 1 table, 2 chairs, a single lamp throwing yellow light across a concrete floor. Hyo-sun sat down across from his boss and did not look away. "You had Min-hee's face cut," Ji-hwan said. "For a shipment." Hyo-sun said nothing. "Look at me." He did. She was 23 years old. Ji-hwan's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The men who feared him most were the ones who had learned that the quieter he became, the more certain the outcome. Something moved in Hyo-sun's face. Not regret. Something older than regret. "That's the problem with you," he said. "You always had a sister. You always had something soft underneath all of this." He gestured at the walls, the organization pressing in from every direction. "Your father saw it early. He always saw it. He said that softness needed to be addressed before it could compromise everything he built." Ji-hwan went still. "Your father ordered the first cut." Hyo-sun's voice flattened out. The voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has decided finally to set it down. 12 years ago, the incident in Busan that everyone called a robbery. That wasn't a robbery. That was a lesson, designed by the man who built this empire, to harden his son into someone capable of holding it. He leaned forward. I didn't betray you, Ji Huan. I followed the tradition you were raised in. The lamp hummed. A water pipe knocked somewhere in the wall. The silence stretched to its limit. Ji Huan stood. He straightened his jacket. Slow, deliberate, one button at a time. He looked at Hyo-san with an expression the man had never once seen on his boss's face. Not rage, not cold authority. Something much more final. Like a door being closed from the inside and the handle removed. You confused obedience to my father, Ji Huan said quietly, with loyalty to me. He walked out. But here is what he didn't know yet, walking out of that room. The worst thing in this story wasn't Hyo-san. Wasn't even his father. It was sitting in a file that a man named Miller had been building for 3 months. And Miller had already found Zoraida. While Ji Huan was pulling apart one betrayal, something else was being assembled on the other side of the city. And the woman at the center of it had no idea. Here is what Zoraida didn't know about men like Ji Huan. The more carefully they move, the more certain they already are. He had made his decision the night he sat in that dark office after leaving the clinic. Everything that followed was just him being thorough. He found out her schedule. He found out the flower stall near the hospital entrance was her ritual. 2 stems of whatever was freshest, every single morning before her shift. He found out she took her lunch on the roof when the weather was bearable, standing at the edge with her food and her phone and the kind of quiet that busy people find in high, empty places. He found out she walked to the bus stop 3 blocks east after late shifts, stood there with her eyes closed for exactly 1 minute, and then opened them and got on. He had that kind of information about her before she knew his real name. He bought the flower stall, not sent flowers, bought the building. The vendor stayed in place. The arrangement was simple. Fresh peonies every morning. Because she'd mentioned them once, in passing, to a colleague in a conversation she didn't know anyone was listening to, and his people had been thorough. The first morning she received them, she stood at the stall with a small frown, turning 1 stem in her fingers, calculating how the old vendor had managed such an upgrade. Second morning she asked him directly. He smiled and said a generous customer had been very specific about it. Third morning, she stood with the arrangement in both hands for a long moment, looking at it, before she carried it inside without a word. She was beginning to understand that something was happening. She wasn't afraid of it yet. He started appearing after her late shifts. No fanfare, no motorcade. She'd mentioned once that the security detail made the hospital staff uneasy, and he'd adjusted without being asked twice. Just a black car idling at the bus stop with the rear window down and Ji Huan in the back seat with a container of the groundnut soup she'd recommended to a colleague 4 days ago, still warm from the restaurant, wrapped in cloth to hold the heat. The first time she walked up to the car window and looked at him. I don't accept rides from men I don't know. Then ask me something, he said. She held his gaze. What's your sister's favorite food? He answered without hesitating. She got in. She didn't make it easy for him. That was the thing about Zoraida. She didn't perform warmth or gratitude, or the careful, measured softness that men with power usually expected in return for generosity. She was exactly what she'd been in that treatment room. Direct, unhurried, unimpressed by surfaces, focused entirely on what was real underneath them. When he told her he ran a logistics company, she nodded once and said nothing. He could see immediately that she understood the description was incomplete. She had decided, for reasons of her own, to let him carry the weight of that partial truth until he was ready to put it down himself. She asked about Min-hee at every opportunity, not as a strategy, because her attention to the people she treated didn't end when the bandages came off. How was the healing? Was she sleeping? Was anyone making sure she talked to someone? Had she gone back to her routine, or was she still avoiding the things that reminded her? Jihuan answered every question with the specific, slightly disoriented patience of a man who has spent his entire adult life being the one who asks. Then one morning she called his personal line. He was mid-briefing, 12 people in the room. He stepped out before the call connected. "She's eating," Zoraida said. "She's eating." "Good. Trauma disrupts appetite for weeks sometimes. Keep monitoring it." "Is that why you called?" A pause. Not long, but the kind of pause that has something in it. "I also wanted to know," she said, carefully, "if you were eating." He didn't answer right away, which between them by now was answer enough. "Jihuan," she said. Not a title, not a warning. His name, exactly the way a real person says a real name. "I'll eat," he said. "That's not what I asked." He closed his eyes. Outside his office window, the city spread in every direction, the whole complicated weight of it. And somewhere out in it was this woman who had looked through every layer he'd built and apparently was not alarmed by what she found underneath. "I'll call you when I've got an answer," he said. He called that night. Late. They talked until the city went quiet around them. After that, he stopped sending cars and started showing up himself. Plain coat, no detail, 2 coffees. 3 blocks to the park near the bus stop. Their bench. Steam rising from the cups into cold November air. The creak of the wooden slats when one of them shifted. Talking the way 2 people talk when they're learning each other and keep finding no reason to stop. He told her things he hadn't said out loud in years. Not strategic things, personal things. What Minhee was like as a child. What he remembered about his father before understanding replaced memory. What he thought about at night when the city was quiet and the work was done, and there was nothing left to manage. She listened. Actually listened. Not waiting for her turn, not assembling a response, just taking in what he said and letting it mean something. And then she talked. About Lagos. About the particular discipline of her mother's kitchen, the smell of crayfish and palm oil, and the way certain songs still carried the weight of specific afternoons. About why she'd moved to Seoul. About her father. Carefully, briefly, with the practiced restraint of someone who has learned to carry that specific grief in a small, contained space so it doesn't spill. Jihuan listened the way she had taught him to, without filling the pauses. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Sitting on a cold park bench with no security and no armor, letting another person learn him. He knew it. He kept showing up anyway. He should have known that someone was watching. He should have known that Miller had already found her. Subscribe right now. I mean it. Tell me where you are, because this next part is where everything breaks open, and you need to be here when it does. Detective Miller arrived in Zoraida's life like he'd always been there. American, early 50s, broad across the shoulders with a lived-in face, and the particular ease of someone trained to make people feel safe within minutes. He introduced himself at the hospital during a routine liaison visit, knew her name before she offered it, brought coffee without being asked, made her laugh about American versus Korean coffee culture within 20 minutes of sitting down. By their third conversation, she considered him a friend. That was exactly the design. Miller was not a detective, not in any real sense. He was an arms trafficker, 12 years running, embedded so completely inside Seoul's law enforcement structure that the department's own systems would vouch for him if anyone ran a check. He was also the middleman on a weapons deal Jihuan had personally dismantled 4 months ago at a cost of $17 million to the buyers. He had been building his leverage file ever since, and Jihuan had handed him the instrument without knowing. The night Miller moved, it was fast and precise. He called Zoraida with a fabricated emergency. A former patient, young woman, discharged the previous week. Found collapsed 2 blocks from the hospital, asking for Zoraida by name. She didn't hesitate. She never hesitated when someone needed her. She walked out into the cold without calling anyone, without telling anyone where she was going. She walked into the wrong building, By the time Ji Huan's security team registered the anomaly in her movement and traced her location to the warehouse district south of the Han River, she had been inside for 40 minutes. The room Miller had prepared was clean and warm. Folding table, 2 chairs, a portable heater ticking steadily in the corner, a thermos of tea on the table beside the folder. He had arranged it to look nothing like what it was. He poured the tea. He sat across from her with the careful, sorrowful expression of a man delivering news he genuinely wishes he didn't have. "He'll tell you it's complicated," Miller said. "Men like him always say that. It's what they say when they want you to forgive them without requiring the details." He pushed the folder across the table. "But you deserve the details, Zoraida. You deserve the truth about the man you've been letting into your life." She opened it. Photographs. Shipping manifests, operational records with Ji Huan's name running through them like a thread that connected everything. She turned the pages steadily, face still, hands flat on the table. She had learned a long time ago how to hold herself together when something was working hard to take her apart. Then she reached the page near the bottom. Her father's name. Emmanuel Etienne, civil engineer. A careful, serious man who had spent his career building water infrastructure across West Africa, who had died in Lagos 12 years ago in what the official reports called a targeted attack connected to a land dispute. Those reports had never felt complete. She had known it from the beginning. She had carried that incompleteness the way you carry something heavy, not thinking about it constantly, just always aware of the weight on one side of you, always adjusting for it. Miller showed her what the reports had left out. The land connected to a logistics operation. The logistics operation connected to an overseas syndicate. The syndicate connected, through 3 layers of corporate structure and 12 years of deliberate distance, to a chairman in Seoul, to Ji Huan. The thermos of tea sat between them, steam rising from the open lid. The heater ticked. Outside, traffic moved somewhere in the distance, muffled and indifferent. Zoraida sat with the folder open in her hands. She thought about the hands that had brushed hair from her face in that treatment room, the hands that had held a coffee cup on a cold November morning just to walk 3 blocks beside her. The hands she had begun to trust in the way she didn't allow herself to trust easily, slowly, deliberately, with the specific courage of someone who has been alone long enough to know what it costs. Those same hands might have signed the chain of decisions that ended her father's life. Ji Huan's team extracted her within the hour. Miller was taken somewhere else for a separate conversation that did not involve tea. When Ji Huan walked through the door and saw the folder open on the table in front of her, he knew. He could see what she'd been shown. He could read the particular quality of her stillness. Not crumpled, not crying, just sitting with the kind of absolute quiet that arrives after something enormous. Something in his face fractured. Not managed, not performed, just cracked, and he couldn't reassemble it fast enough for her not to see it. She looked up at him. "Tell me it isn't true." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He told her everything, the operation, the structure, the chain of decisions, where her father's name appeared in the record, how far his own authorization had or hadn't reached. He laid it out fact by fact without softening it, without framing it, without managing it toward any particular outcome, because she was the only person in his life who had ever required truth in exchange for presence, and he could not give her anything less than the full weight of it. She listened without moving, without speaking. When he finished, she closed the folder. "The way you close. Something you know you can't put back the way it was." She stood up. "Take me home," she said, "and don't contact me. Zoraida, please." He took her home. He didn't contact her. And the thing they had been building, carefully, honestly, on park benches in November cold, went completely silent. The city that had contained something extraordinary contracted back into something gray and ordinary, and Ji Huan moved through it doing the only thing he knew how to do when everything else had stopped working. He worked. Subscribe right now because this is where everything turns. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's here with me before we go into this last part. Lady Kang arrived on a Wednesday morning. Ji Huan saw her through the kitchen window before she knocked. Cream silk hanbok, unhurried steps across the front path. The expression of a woman who has spent so long managing the people around her that she has stopped distinguishing between control and love. He opened the door and let her in without a word. She sat at his kitchen table, a table she had never sat at, in a house she had never once visited in the years he had lived there. The winter light came through the window behind her. Half a glass of water sat between them on the wood surface. The refrigerator hummed. The house was quiet in the specific way of a space that usually holds only one person. She folded her hands and looked at him. He sat across from her and waited. "Hyo-san didn't act alone," she said. "I know. Miller didn't find the girl on his own either. I know that too." The silence that followed was the kind that happens between two people when the pretense they have both maintained, for the sake of something that matters to both of them, finally runs out of room to breathe. "You orchestrated it," Ji Huan said. Not a question. Lady Kang didn't look away from him. "I needed to know if you could protect her. You used her father's death as a test." "Yes." The word sat between them, heavy, real. She didn't move to soften it. She had built 30 years inside an organization that measured everything by what it could withstand, and she had watched her son begin to come loose around a woman he had known for 2 months. She needed to see if that looseness was weakness. Needed to know if Zoraida Essien could bear the weight of this family's history and still choose to be near it. "She's remarkable," Lady Kang said, and this time something in her voice was not strategy, not performance, something quieter and older, something that had to push through years of managed distance to surface it all. She walked into that room and treated Minhee like she was the only person on earth. "She looked at you like you were a man and not a chairman." A pause. I needed to know if she could survive learning what that man had done. Ji Huan looked at his mother for a long time. Long enough to see past the hanbok and the composure, and the control that had been her armor for as long as he could remember, and find underneath it something he had not expected to see today. Regret. "You almost destroyed the only thing that has ever made me want to change what I am," he said. She looked at her hands. He stood. He buttoned his jacket, one button at a time, and picked up his coat from the chair. The winter light was thin and flat through the window. The city spread out beyond the glass, gray and still. "I'm going to dismantle it," he said. "All of it. Everything that can't survive the light, I'm handing it over. Every operation, every record, every arrangement that crossed a line that should never have been crossed." He looked at her. "The shipping company stays. The logistics structure stays. Everything built on blood doesn't." Lady Kang lifted her eyes to his. "I'll make sure you're not included in what I hand over, not because you don't owe it, because you're my mother. And I've decided that loving someone and holding them accountable aren't the same thing. I can do both." He walked to the door. He stopped. "I'll call you when it's done." He left. The calls to the international authorities took 48 hours. Ji Huan organized every document himself, every record, every chain of connection mapped in his own handwriting, because this was the last thing he would ever do as chairman, and he intended to do it correctly. Miller was in custody within 72 hours. The charges were extensive. He wasn't going to threaten anyone ever again. Hyo-sun's holdings were seized. When Hyo-sun understood what had happened, that Ji Huan had dismantled not just his position, but the entire structure beneath them both, he went quiet in the way that people go quiet when there is genuinely nothing left to say. You can't negotiate with a man who has already burned the table. Ji Huan stood in the ruins of the empire he had been handed at 22 years old. The thing that had defined him, the weight he had worn so long it had become invisible, and put it down. And felt, for the first time in longer than he could measure, something that was not weight. He had one more thing to do. He found her at the park. Of course he did. She was on their bench. In her coat, off duty, a paper cup of something warm held in both hands, watching the Han River move slow and gray in the afternoon light. Bare branches overhead. The city muffled and far away, like someone had turned down the volume on everything but this. The cold came off the water in waves. Her breath made small, steady clouds in the air in front of her. She heard him coming. She didn't look up. He stopped in front of her. And then, without strategy, without composure, without calculating a single thing, Ji-Huan lowered himself to one knee on the cold concrete path in his good suit and looked up at the woman who had walked through his life like clean air through a locked room. Not the gesture of a chairman. Not a performance. A man who has put everything down and come with empty hands. Zoraida looked at him. Her face moved through something complicated and private, something she had been carrying alone for 3 weeks. And then it settled into a stillness that wasn't closed, that was listening. "I can't change where I came from," he said. "I can't give your father back. I'm not asking you to forgive the world that took him." He held her gaze. "I'm here because I've burned it down. The structure, the protection, the identity I've worn since I was 22 years old. All of it. I handed it over." He opened his hand. A single business card in his palm. His name above the address of the legitimate shipping company. Nothing else. "This is what's left. It's clean. It's real. And it's yours to refuse." She looked at the card. She looked at the man holding it. She had spent 3 weeks actually sitting with this. Not performing grief or anger. Sitting with the real thing, the complicated, specific weight of it. A man she had come to know and a man whose organization was connected to her oldest loss, and the question of whether those two things could exist in the same person and still be chosen. She was a trauma nurse. She understood the distance between what something had been and what it was becoming. That distance was the only one that mattered in medicine. It was the only one that mattered here. She had also spent 3 weeks missing him. Not the peonies, not the car. The way he listened without filling the pauses. The way he'd told Minhee's guard to wait in the hallway because his sister wanted privacy, and had understood immediately, without being asked, without needing it explained, that her comfort mattered more than his protocol. The way he'd called late and stayed on the line because neither of them had wanted to stop. The way he was kneeling right now on cold concrete and offering her the right to refuse. She reached out and took the card from his hand. She turned it over once. She looked at the water for a moment. Then she stood up. She took his lapels in both hands and pulled him to his feet. He stood in front of her, the card between her fingers, their breath mixing in the cold air. The Seoul skyline pressing its lights up into the gray above them. "You bought a flower stall," she said. "Yes. That's not a normal thing to do." "No." She looked at him steadily. "You need to understand something. I'm not the reward for your transformation. I'm not the soft thing you get to hold because you finally made the right choice. If you're going to be in my life, it's because you're worthy of being there, not because you burned something down to get here." "I know," he said. "Trauma units," she said. "Real ones. Under-resourced communities. Places like where my father lived, where the systems failed people like him. 3 in Lagos, 2 in Abidjan. Legal structures already filed." Something in her face, something she had been holding very carefully in reserve since the moment she sat down on this bench, opened. "And you tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Always. Not when it's convenient. Immediately." "Always," he said. She held his gaze one more moment with eyes that had never once been afraid of what they found. Then she smoothed his lapels flat with both hands. Brisk, efficient. The gesture of a woman who keeps things in order. and turned toward the park exit. "Come on," she said. "I've been on that bench for an hour and I'm cold and you owe me dinner." He fell into step beside her. Not behind her. Not in front of her. Beside her. Which was the only position that had ever made sense for these two people, from the moment she came around that corner in a clinic full of frozen people and kept walking. Months later, a single peony sat in a glass on their kitchen counter, not from a stall he owned, from the market 3 blocks away. She had bought it, herself that morning. Cream-colored, beginning to open in the warm kitchen light, petals curling softly at the edges. Ji-hwan saw it when he came in from the cold, still in his coat, the morning still on him. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it for a long moment, said nothing. The expression on his face didn't belong to a chairman, to a man who had ever run anything, to anyone who had needed to be anything other than what he was right now. A person standing in a kitchen where someone had thought to put a flower. On the table behind the peony, 3 red roses. He left them every morning. No ceremony, no explanation. Just roses, because she had mentioned once that she liked them, and he had listened. And the man who had once managed entire organizations remembered the small things she said as though they were coordinates he couldn't afford to lose. Because they were. She came in from the balcony and found him still standing in the doorway. "You're letting the cold in?" she said. He came inside. He closed the door. She turned back to the window. The Seoul skyline spread out in front of them, gray and glittering. Ordinary in the way that cities become ordinary when you are finally, completely at home inside your own life. He crossed the kitchen and stood behind her, arms around her, his chin against her shoulder. His hands, which had signed empires and closed doors and held power until its weight became invisible, now simply holding her. Steady, unhurried. Like this was what they had been for, all along. And everything else? The empire, the betrayals, the long and difficult road of becoming someone worth trusting, had only ever been the way to get here. Outside, Seoul kept moving. Cold air and distant lights, and the city doing what cities do, indifferent and bright and endless. Inside, a peony opened one more petal in the warm light. And the only red in their lives was the roses he left every single morning. Not as proof, not as a gesture, just because she liked them. Just because he remembered. Subscribe to this channel because there are more stories where this one came from. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your name and your city, and whether this one reached you the way I hoped it would. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been told that the people who hurt you define your worth, that what you come from is what you are, share this with them. Because Ji-hwan gave up a throne, and standing in that kitchen with the cold still on his coat and roses on the table and her in front of the window, he had not had one single regret. Some people are born into power. Some earn it. And some people, the rare ones, the dangerous ones, burn it down to become someone worth loving. The question is whether you believe people can really change. I think you already know the answer. Because you're still here.